Day 13, Chapter 8, Flies and Spiders, Part 1. They walked in single file. The entrance to the path was like a sort of arch leading into a gloomy tunnel made by two great trees that leant together, too old and strangled with ivy and hung with lichen to bear more than a few blackened leaves. The path itself was narrow and wound in and out among the trunks. Soon the light at the gate was like a little bright hole far behind, and the quiet was so deep that their feet seemed to thump along while all the trees leaned over them and listened. As their eyes became used to the dimness, they could see a little way to either side in a sort of darkened green glimmer. Occasionally, a slender beam of sun that had the luck to slip in through some opening in the leaves far above, and still more luck in not being caught in the tangled boughs and matted twigs beneath, stabbed down thin and bright before them. But this was seldom, and it soon ceased altogether. There were black squirrels in the wood. As Bilbo's sharp, inquisitive eyes got used to seeing things, he could catch glimpses of them, whisking off the path and scuttling behind tree trunks. There were queer noises too, grunts, scufflings and hurryings in undergrowth, and among the leaves that lay piled endlessly thick in places on the forest floor. But what made the noises he could not see. The nastiest things they saw were the cobwebs, dark, dense cobwebs, with threads extraordinarily thick, often stretched from tree to tree or tangled in the lower branches on either side of them. There were none stretched across the path, but whether because some magic kept it clear, or for what other reason, they could not guess. It was not long before they grew to hate the forest, as heartily as they'd hated the tunnels of the goblins, and it seemed to offer even less hope of any ending. But they had to go on and on, long after they were sick for a sight of the sun and of the sky, and longed for the feel of wind on their faces. There was no movement of air down under the forest roof, and it was everlastingly still and dark and stuffy. Even the dwarfs felt it, who were used to tunnelling and live at times for long whiles without the light of the sun. But the hobbit who liked holes to make a house in, but not to spend summer days in, felt that he was being slowly suffocated. The nights were the worst. It then became pitch dark. Not what you call pitch dark, but really pitch. So black that you really could see nothing. Bilbo tried flapping his hand in front of his nose, but he could not see it at all. Well, perhaps it's not true to say that they could see nothing. They could see eyes. They slept all closely huddled together and took it in turns to watch. And when it was Bilbo's turn, he would see gleams in the darkness round them, and sometimes pairs of yellow or red or green eyes would stare at him from a little distance, and then slowly fade and disappear, and slowly shine out again in another place. And sometimes they would gleam down from the branches just above him, and that was most terrifying. But the eyes that he liked the least were horrible, pale, bulbous sort of eyes. Insect eyes, he thought, not animal eyes, only they are much too big. Although it was not yet very cold, they tried lighting watchfires at night, but they soon gave that up. It seemed to bring hundreds and hundreds of eyes all round them, though the creatures, whatever they were careful never to let their bodies show in the little flicker of the flames. Worse still, it brought thousands of dark grey and black moths, some nearly as big as your hand, flapping and whirring round their ears. They could not stand that, nor the huge bats, black as a top hat, either, so they gave up fires and sat at night and dozed in the enormous, uncanny darkness. All this went on for what seemed to the hobbit ages upon ages, and he was always hungry, for they were extremely careful with their provisions. Even so, as days followed days, and still the forest seemed just the same, they began to get anxious. The food would not last forever. It was, in fact, already beginning to get low. They tried shooting at the squirrels, and they wasted many arrows before they managed to bring one down on the path. But when they roasted it, it proved horrible to taste, and they shot no more squirrels. They were thirsty too, for they had none too much water, and in all the time they'd seen neither spring nor stream. This was the state when one day they found their path blocked by a running water. It flowed fast and strong, but not very wide right across the way, and it was black, or looked it in the gloom. It was well that Bjorn had warned them against it, or they would have drunk from it, whatever its colour, and filled some of their emptied skins at its bank. As it was, they only thought of how to cross it without wetting themselves in its water. There being a bridge of wood across, but it had rotted and fallen, leaving only the broken posts near the bank. Bilbo, kneeling on the brink and peering forward, cried, "There is a boat against the far bank. Now why couldn't it have been this side?" "How far away do you think it is?" asked Thorin, for by now they knew Bilbo had the sharpest eye among them. "Not at all far, I shouldn't think. Above 12 yards. 12 yards? I should have thought it was 30 at least, but my eyes don't see as well as they used to 100 years ago. Still, 12 yards is as good as a mile. We can't jump it, and we daren't try to wade or swim. Can any of you throw a rope?" "What's the good of that? The boat is sure to be tied up, even if we could hook it, which I doubt." "I don't believe it is tied," said Bilbo, "though of course I can't be sure in this light, but it looks to me as if it was just drawn up on the bank, which is low, just where the path goes down into the water. Dory is the strongest, but Billy is the youngest, and still has the best sight," said Thorin. "Come here, Billy, and see if you can see the boat Mr. Baggins is talking about." Billy thought he could, so when he had stared a long while to get an idea of the direction, the others brought him a rope. They had several with them, and on the end of the longest they fastened one of the large iron hooks that they used for catching their packs to the straps about their shoulders. Billy took this in his hand, balanced it for a moment, and then flung it across the stream. Splash! It fell in the water. "Not far enough," said Bilbo, who was peering forward. "A couple of feet and you would have dropped it onto the boat. Try again. I don't suppose the magic is strong enough to hurt you if you just touch a bit of the wet rope." Billy picked up the hook when he had drawn it back, rather doubtfully all the same. This time he threw it with greater strength. "Steady," said Bilbo. "You have thrown it right into the wood on the other side now. Draw it back gently." Billy hauled the rope back slowly, and after a while Bilbo said carefully, "It is lying on the boat. Let's hope the hook will catch." It did. The rope was taut and Billy pulled in vain. Killy came in to his help, and then Oin and Gloin. They tugged, and suddenly they all fell over on their backs. Bilbo was on the lookout, however, caught the rope, and with a piece of stick fended off the little black boat as it came rushing across the stream. "Help!" he shouted, and Balin was just in time to seize the boat before it floated off down the current. "It was tied after all," said he, looking at the snapped painter that was still dangling from it. "That was a good pull, my lads, and a good job that our rope was the stronger." "Who'll cross first?" asked Bilbo. "I shall," said Thorin, "and you will come with me, and Billy and Balin. That's as many as the boat will hold at a time. After that, Killy and Oin, and Gloin and Dory. Next, Ori and Nori, Biffer and Buffer, and last, Dwalin and Bomber." "I'm always last, and I don't like it," said Bomber. "It's somebody else's turn today." "You should not be so fat. As you are, you must be with the last and lightest boatload. Don't start grumbling against orders or something bad will happen to you." "There aren't any oars. How are you going to push the boat back to the far bank?" asked the Hobbit. "Give me another length of rope and another hook," said Billy, and when they got it ready, he cast it into the darkness, ahead and as high as he could throw it. Since it did not fall down again, they saw that it must have stuck to the branches. "Get in now," said Billy, "and one of you haul on the rope that is stuck in a tree on the other side. One of the others must keep hold of the hook we used at first, and when we are safe on the other side, he can hook it on, and you can draw the boat back." In this way, they were all soon on the far bank, safe across the enchanted stream. Dwalin had just scrambled out with the coiled rope on his arm, and Bomber, still grumbling, was getting ready to follow when something bad did happen. There was a flying sound of hooves on the path ahead. Out of the gloom came suddenly the shape of a flying deer. It charged into the dwarfs and bowled them over, then gathered itself for a leap. High it sprang and cleared the water with a mighty jump, but it did not reach the other side in safety. Thorin was the only one who had kept his feet and his wits. As soon as they had landed, he had bent his bow and fitted an arrow in case any hidden guardian of the boat appeared. Now he sent a swift and sure shot into the leaping beast. As it reached the further bank, it stumbled. The shadow swallowed it up, but they heard the sound of hooves quickly falter and then go still. Before they could shout in praise of the shot, however, a dreadful wail from Bilbo put all thoughts of venison out of their minds. "Bomber is fallen in! Bomber is drowning!" he cried. It was only too true. Bomber had only 1 foot on the land when the heart bore down on him and sprang over him. He had stumbled, thrusting the boat away from the bank, and then toppled back into the dark water, his hand slipping off the slimy roots at the edge, while the boat spun slowly off and disappeared. They could still see his hood above the water when they ran to the bank. Quickly they flung a rope with a hook towards him. His hand caught it and they pulled him to the shore. He was drenched from hair to boots, of course, but that was not the worst. When they laid him on the bank, he was already fast asleep, with one hand clutching the rope so tight they could not get it from his grasp. And fast asleep he remained, in spite of all they could do. They were still standing over him, cursing their ill luck and Bomber's clumsiness and lamenting the loss of the boat, which made it impossible for them to go back and look for the heart, when they became aware of the dim blowing of horns in the wood and the sound as of dogs baying far off. Then all fell silent, and as they sat, it seemed they could hear the noise of a great hunt going by the north of the path, though they saw no sign of it. There they sat for a long while and did not dare to make a move. Bomber slept on, while with a smile on his fat face, as if he no longer cared for all the troubles that vexed them. Suddenly on the path ahead appeared some white deer, a hind and fawns, as snowy white as the heart had been dark. They glimmered in the shadows. Before Thorin could cry out, 3 of the dwarfs had leapt to their feet and loosened off arrows from their bows. None seemed to find their mark. The deer turned and vanished into the trees as silently as they had come, and in vain the dwarfs shot their arrows after them. "Stop, stop," shouted Thorin, but it was too late. The excited dwarfs had wasted their last arrows, and now the bows that Bjorn had given them were useless. They were a gloomy party that night, and the gloom gathered still deeper on them in the following days. They crossed the enchanted stream, but beyond it the path seemed to straggle on just as before, and in the forest they could see no change. Yet, if they had known more about it, and considered the meaning of the hunt and the white deer that had appeared upon their path, they would have known that they were at last drawing together the eastern edge, and would soon have come, if they could have kept up their courage and their hope, to thinner trees and places where the sunlight came again. But they did not know this, and they were burdened with the heavy body of Bomber, which they had to carry along with them as best they could, taking the wearisome task in turns of 4, each while the others shared their packs. If these had not become all too light in the last few days, they would never have managed it. But a slumbering and smiling Bomber was a poor exchange for packs filled with food, however heavy. In a few days, a time came when there was practically nothing left to eat or to drink. Nothing wholesome could they see growing in the wood, only funguses and herbs with pale leaves and unpleasant smell. About 4 days from the enchanted stream, they came to a part where most of the trees were beeches. They were at first inclined to be cheered by the change, but here there was no undergrowth and the shadow was not so deep. There was a greenish light about them, and in places they could see some distance to either side of the path. Yet the light only showed them endless lines of straight grey trunks like the pillars of some huge twilight hall. There was a breath of air and a noise of wind, but it had a sad sound. A few leaves came rustling down to remind them that outside autumn was coming on. Their feet ruffled among the dead leaves of countless other autumns that drifted over the banks of the path from the deep red carpets of the forest. Still Bomber slept, and they grew very weary. At times they heard disquieting laughter. Sometimes they were singing in the distance too. The laughter was the laughter of fair voices, not of goblins, and of singing was beautiful, but it sounded eerie and strange, and they were not comforted. Rather, they hurried on from these parts with what strength they had left. 2 days later, they found their path going downwards, and before long they were in a valley filled almost entirely with a mighty growth of oaks. "Is there no end to this accursed forest?" said Thorin. "Somebody must climb a tree and see if he can get his head above the roof and have a look round. The only way is to choose the tallest tree that overhangs the path." Of course somebody meant Bilbo. They chose him because to be of any use the climber must get his head above the topmost leaves, and so he must be light enough for the highest and slenderest branches to bear him. Poor Mr. Baggins had never had much practice in climbing trees, but they hoisted him up into the lowest branches of an enormous oak that grew right out into the path, and up he had to go as best he could. He pushed his way through the tangled twigs with many a slap in the eye. He was grained and grimed from the old bark of the greater boughs. More than once he slipped and caught himself just in time, and at last, after a dreadful struggle in a difficult place where there seemed to be no convenient branches at all, he got near the top. All the time he was wondering whether there were spiders in the tree and how he was going to get down again, except by falling. In the end he poked his head above the roof of leaves, and then he found spiders all right, but they were only small ones of ordinary size, and they were after the butterflies. Bilbo's eyes were nearly blinded by the light. He could hear the dwarf shouting up at him from far below, but he could not answer, only hold on and blink. The sun was shining brilliantly, and it was a long while before he could bear it. When he could, he saw all around him a sea of dark green, ruffled here and there by the breeze, and there were everywhere hundreds of butterflies. I expect they were a kind of purple emperor, a butterfly that loves the top of oak wood, but these were not purple at all. They were a dark, velvety black without any markings to be seen. He looked at the black emperors for a long time and enjoyed the feel of the breeze in his hair and on his face, but at length the cries of the dwarfs were now simply stamping with impatience down below, reminded him of his real business. It was no good. Gaze as much as he might, he could see no end to the trees and the leaves in any direction. His heart, that had been lightened by the sight of the sun and the feel of the wind, sank back into his toes. There was no food to go back to down below. Actually, as I've told you, they were not far off the edge of the forest, and if Bilbo had had the sense to see it, the tree that he had climbed, though it was tall in itself, was standing near the bottom of a wide valley, so that from its top the trees seemed to swell up all around like the edges of a great bowl, and he could not expect to see how far the forest lasted. Still, he did not see this, and he climbed down full of despair. He got to the bottom again at last, scratched, hot and miserable, and he could not see anything in the gloom below when he got there. His report soon made the others as miserable as he was. The forest goes on forever and ever and ever in all directions. Whatever shall we do? What is the use of sending a hobbit? They cried, as if it was his fault. They did not care twopence about the butterflies, and were only made more angry when he told them of the beautiful breeze, which they were too heavy to climb up and feel. That night they ate their very last scraps and crumbs of food, and next morning when they woke, the first thing they noticed was that they were still gnawingly hungry, and the next thing was that it was raining, and that here and there the drip of it was dropping heavily on the forest floor. That only reminded them that they were also parchingly thirsty, without doing anything to relieve them. You cannot quench a terrible thirst by standing under giant oaks and waiting for a chance drip to fall on your tongue. The only scrap of comfort there was came unexpectedly from Bomber. He woke up suddenly and sat up scratching his head. He could not make out where he was at all, nor why he felt so hungry, for he had forgotten everything that had happened since the start of their journey that May morning long ago. The last thing that he remembered was the party at the Hobbit's house, and their great difficulty in making him believe their tale of all the many adventures they had had since. When he heard that there was nothing to eat, he sat down and wept, for he felt very weak and wobbly in the legs. "Why ever did I wake up?" he cried. "I was having such beautiful dreams. I dreamt I was walking in a forest rather like this one, only little torches on the trees and lamps swinging from the branches and fires burning on the ground. And there was a great feast going on forever. A woodland king was there with a crown of leaves, and there was a merry singing, and I could not count or describe the things there were to eat and drink." "You need not try," said Thorin. "In fact, if you can't talk about something else, you'd better be silent. We are quite annoyed enough with you as it is. If you hadn't waked up, we should have left you to your idiotic dreams in the forest. You're no joke to carry even after weeks of shortcomings." There was nothing now to be done but to tighten the belts round their empty stomachs and hoist their empty sacks and packs and trudge along the track without any great hope of ever getting to the end before they lay down and died of starvation. This they did all that day, going very slowly and wearily, while Bomber kept on wailing that his legs would not carry him, that he wanted to lie down and sleep. "No, you don't," they said. "Let your legs take their share. We have carried you far enough." All the same, he suddenly refused to go a step further and flung himself on the ground. "Go on if you must," he said. "I'm going to lie here and sleep and dream of food if I can't get it any other way. I hope I never wake up again." At that very moment, Balin, who was a little way ahead, called out, "What was that? I thought I saw a twinkle of light in the forest." They all looked, and a longish way off, it seemed, there was a red twinkle in the dark. Then another, and another sprang out beside it. Even Bomber got up, and they hurried along then, not caring if it was trolls or goblins. The light was in front of them and to the left of the path, and when at last they'd drawn level with it, it seemed plain that torches and fires were burning under the trees, but a good way off their track. "It looks as if my dreams were coming true," gasped Bomber, puffing up behind. He wanted to rush straight off into the wood after the lights, but the others remembered only too well the warnings of the wizard and Bjorn. "A feast would be no good if we never got back alive from it," said Thorin. "But without a feast, we shan't remain alive much longer anyway," said Bomber, and Bilbo heartily agreed with him. They argued about it backwards and forwards for a long while, until they agreed at length to send out a couple of spies to creep near the lights and find out more about them. But then they could not agree on who was to be sent. No one seemed anxious to run the chance of being lost and never finding his friends again. In the end, in spite of warnings, hunger decided them, because Bomber kept on describing all the good things that were being eaten according to his dream in the woodland feast. So they all left the path and plunged into the forest together. After a good deal of creeping and crawling, they peered around the trunks and looked into a clearing where some trees had been felled and the ground levelled. There were many people there, elvish-looking folk, all dressed in green and brown and sitting on sawn rings of the felled trees in a great circle. There was a fire in their midst, and there were torches fastened to some of the trees around them. But most splendid sight of all, they were eating and drinking and laughing merrily. The smell of the roast meats was so enchanting that without waiting to consult one another, every one of them got up and scrambled forwards into the ring with the idea of begging for some food. No sooner had the first stepped into the clearing than all the light went out as if by magic. Somebody kicked the fire and it went up in rockets of glittering sparks and vanished. They were lost in a completely lightless dark, and they could not even find one another. Not for a long time at any rate. After blundering frantically in the gloom, falling over logs, bumping, crashing into trees, and shouting, calling till they must have waked everything in the forest for miles, at least they managed to gather themselves in a bundle and count themselves by touch. By the time they had, of course, quite forgotten in what direction the path lay, and they were all hopelessly lost, at least till morning. There was nothing for it but to settle down for the night where they were. They did not even dare to search on the ground for scraps of food for fear of becoming separated again. But they'd not been lying long, and Bilbo was only just getting drowsy when Dory, whose turn it was to watch first, said in a loud whisper, "The lights are coming out again over there, and there are more than ever of them." Up they all jumped. Just sure enough, not far away were scores of twinkling lights, and they heard the voices and the laughter quite plainly. They crept slowly towards them in a single file, each touching the back of the one in front. When they got near, Thorin said, "No rushing forward this time. No one is to stir from hiding till I say. I shall send Mr. Baggins along first to talk to them. They won't be frightened of him. What about me of them?" thought Bilbo. "And anyway, I hope they won't do anything nasty to him." When they got to the edge of the circle of lights, they pushed Bilbo suddenly from behind. Before he had time to slip on his ring, he stumbled forward into the full blaze of the fire and torches. It was no good. Out went all the lights again, and complete darkness fell. It had been difficult collecting themselves before. It was far worse this time, and they simply could not find the Hobbit. Every time they counted themselves, they only made 13. They shouted and called, "Bilbo Baggins, Hobbit, you dratted Hobbit. Hi, Hobbit, confiscate you. Where are you?" and other things of that sort. But there was no answer. They were just giving up hope when Dory stumbled across him by sheer luck. In the dark he fell over what he thought was a log, and he found it was the Hobbit curled up fast asleep. It took a deal of shaking to wake him, and when he was awake he was not pleased at all. "I was having such a lovely dream," he grumbled, "all about having a most gorgeous dinner." "Good heavens, he's gone like Bomber," they said. "Don't tell us about dreams. Dream dinners aren't any good, and we can't share them." "They are the best I'm likely to get in this beastly place," he muttered as he lay down beside the dwarfs and tried to go back to sleep and find his dream again. But that was not the last of the lights in the forest. Later, when the night must have been getting old, Keely, who was watching then, came and roused them all again, saying, "There's a regular blaze of light begun not far away. Hundreds of torches and many fires have been lit, suddenly and by magic. Any heart to the singing and the harps." After lying and listening for a while, they found they could not resist the desire to go nearer and try once more to get help. Up they got again, and this time the result was disastrous. The feast that they now saw was greater and more magnificent than before, and at the head of a long line of feasters sat a woodland king with a crown of leaves upon his golden hair. very much as Bomber described the figure in his dream. The elvish folk were passing bowls from hand to hand and across the fires, and some were harping and many were singing. The gleaming hair was twined with flowers. Green and white gems glinted on their collars and their belts, and their faces and their songs were filled with mirth. Loud and clear and fair were those songs, and out stepped Thorin into their midst. Dead silence fell in the middle of a word. Out went all light. The fires leapt up in black smokes. Ashes and cinders were in the eyes of the dwarfs, and the wood was filled again with their clamour and their cries. Bilbo found himself running round and round as he thought, and calling Dory, Nori, Ori, Oin, Gloin, Billy, Killy, Bomber, Biffer, Buffer, Dwalin, Balin, Thorin, Oakenshield, while people he could not see or feel were doing the same all round him, with an occasional Bilbo thrown in. But the cries of the others got steadily further and fainter, and though after a while it seemed to him they changed to yells and cries for help in the far distance, all noise at last died right away, and he was left alone in complete silence and darkness. And that is the end of today's reading.